Good morning. I'm Kimberly Charrington, and I would like to welcome each of you on behalf of the National Institute for Deterrence Studies, otherwise known as NIDS, for tuning into today's Huessy seminar, where the most important interaction is with you. NIDS is a 501c3 nonprofit organization that provides deterrence education by hosting live and virtual events, podcasts, publications on global security, as well as workshops and courses through our NIDS Academy, all in the interest of advancing peace and promoting stability through a strong national security and nuclear deterrent. You can see more of what we have to offer and get involved at thinkdeterrence.com. Please help us grow our membership and our audiences by following us on LinkedIn, X, Rumble, and YouTube, as well as wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Our next virtual Huessy seminar, where we welcome Major General Stacy Jo Huser, Commander of the 20th Air Force at Air Force Global Strike, where she will address how we ensure America's strategic edge. April 25th, we have Strengthening Deterrence for Our 21st Century Missile Defense and New Nuclear Arsenal for a New Era with Bob Peters from the Heritage Foundation. And we have two live events coming up on Capitol Hill at the Capitol Hill Club in Washington, D.C. We have breakfast with Admiral Johnny Wolf speaking on the sea-based U.S. nuclear deterrent and the work of the strategic systems programs. And we also have Uzi Rubin live on June 27th, addressing the growing concerns of missile threats in the Middle East. And you can look for these invitations in your inbox or go to thinkdeterrence.com to our events page to register. You may also email me individually to get your colleagues on the guest list for any future events. We have a lot more than what I just listed already ready for your registration. Now, during our presentation today, we encourage you to write questions in the chat box at any time. When we begin the Q&A portion of this presentation, one of us will read your question that you submitted. However, if you don't get your question answered today, we'll be sure to send it to our speaker afterwards, and they have the option to message you separately, or you can email us afterwards at nids@thinkdeterrence.com, and we'll pass that along. If you like a question that someone else posts in our chat box, feel free to give it a thumbs up so that we can make sure to give that question priority. I want to introduce our host for today's seminar, Mr. Peter Huessy, President and Senior Director of Strategic Deterrence Studies at Geostrategic Analysis and a Senior Fellow here at NIDS. Peter?
Thank you very much, Kimberly, and I want to welcome Brad Roberts, who is Director of the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, Center for Global Security Research. He was previously Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Nuclear and Missile Defense Policy between 2009 and 2013. He served as Policy Director of the Obama Administration's Nuclear Posture Review and the Ballistic Missile Defense Review, and had lead responsibility for that implementation. Prior to that, from 1995 to 2009, Dr. Roberts was a member of the research staff at the Institute for Defense Analyses in Alexandria, and he was an adjunct professor at George Washington University. He wrote a book called The Case for U.S. Nuclear Weapons in the 21st Century, published by Stanford University Press. It was recognized as one of the most outstanding academic titles of 2016. He's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. He has a bachelor's degree from Stanford, a master's from London School of Economics and Political Science, and a PhD in International Relations from Erasmus University. I highly recommend for you, those of you interested, his book, article written in the next chapter in U.S. nuclear policy, which was published the 8th of July, 2024. It's excellent. And I know Brad for basically two big things, I thought. One was his extraordinary compilation of theories of victory, red and blue, which was a really good look at what do the Russians and the bad guys think of when they think about victory, number one. And number two is he coined the phrase, I can't remember, Brad, whether it was escalate to win or escalate to de-escalate, but you and General Hyten tried to get us to understand that the threat to use very limited number of nuclear weapons in a crisis or in a conflict was Mr. Putin and maybe the Chinese strategy of getting us to stand down in a crisis, which I know you're going to address in part because the Posture Commission in 1983 in October, in 2023 said that one of the shortfalls in the United States was that the Russians were thinking of using of nuclear weapons that were coercive and blackmail, and that was particularly at the low-end limited theater thing where we have a real deficit. So I want to thank you again because it's always an honor to have you come and speak with us. You've been a regular speaker during my series for the last number of years. I want to thank you for your really extraordinary work you do at Lawrence Livermore, because it's always a pleasure and real get insights from your work and the publication of some of your other people as well. So on behalf of NIDS and on behalf of Jim Petrosky, who is our president, who's here, and Kimberly and myself, I want to thank you for speaking with us today from beautiful California. So it's over to you, sir.
Peter, thank you for those very kind words. Thank you for the thanks to Kimberly for putting this together for us. Thank you to the Institute for its leadership on these important questions. We've unfortunately re-entered a world in which we need to be on the top of our toes again about deterrence, and you all have helped bring our community forward into this new era. Thank you. My intention is to set out about 15 minutes of introductory remarks and then to have plenty of time for discussion. Surveying the list of people in the registry here, I can see that there will be no lack of interest in provocative things to discuss. It's a good group. Thank you for joining us this morning. My topic is major power rivalry and nuclear stability. Before jumping in, I should say that the views I'm representing here are my personal views. I'm not here to represent the views of Livermore Laboratory or any of its sponsors. And to start on stability, we Americans, of course, have a particular way of thinking about stability arising from our experiences in the Cold War, which were then digested and written about and put into the record by people like Thomas Schelling. Our first major nuclear crisis, the Cuban Missile Crisis, awakened us to the risks that in conflict, one side might feel pressure to go first with nuclear weapons, and indeed it was in our interest that the Russians not feel under pressure to go first. And this led to a long discourse about crisis stability, how to achieve it, how to create a situation in which neither side has the incentive to go first. Then what followed, of course, was the very large buildup by the Soviets and the United States in an attempt to reduce our vulnerability to preempt the first strike. And this raised new questions of a different kind of stability, arms race stability, and the concern, the interest in creating a circumstance in which neither has a reasonable prospect of gaining decisive strategic advantage. And the Soviets didn't completely align with us in our thinking on these matters, but there came over time a convergence of views, and these were perhaps best reflected in the agreed statement that came in conjunction with the signing of START 1 at the end of the Cold War. But that was a brief moment when our thinking had clearly converged and we were able to express a political commitment to cooperative actions to promote a shared vision of strategic stability. Because since then, we have not converged. Of course, we have diverged. And bringing China into the conversation has complicated, of course, and not simplified this. How have we diverged? Well, the United States remains very oriented to the so-called narrow definition of strategic stability, this vision of crisis stability and arms race stability. And thus, we focus very much on developments in Russian and Chinese nuclear postures and in our own posture that might be ill-considered and unhelpful from the perspective of strategic stability in the narrow sense of crisis and arms race stability. Russia clearly articulates a broader view. That's how Putin began a talk on this subject a few years ago. It's time for a broader view of the requirements of strategic stability. And China has adopted a similar view. Rather than focus narrowly on all things nuclear, they focus on all things strategic and take a very broad view of the scope of strategic stability. And rather than focus narrowly on the military domain, they talk about the geopolitical context and the risks, the dangers to stability as they perceive it from American interference in their core interests. And in the circumstance we live in today, moreover, it's been in their common interest to increase the instability that we, the United States and our allies, perceive in the security environment. It's in their interest to do this because a strong, confident, purposeful United States that perceives itself as secure is a danger to them. And in order to reduce the danger presented by American strength, they actively undermine strategic stability as we perceive it, and seek to keep us on the back of our feet, so to speak. So that's a little bit of context about the conceptual framework for thinking about strategic stability and nuclear stability in the 21st century. Well, let's spend a few minutes talking about the U.S. policy approach. In the Cold War, we weren't comfortable with the idea that we needed to move into a situation of mutual vulnerability with the Soviet Union and accept that they should have an ability to respond even if we perceive the need to go first. But this view, this reluctant acceptance of mutual assured destruction or mutual vulnerability became codified, of course, in arms control measures, the ABM Treaty, and the offense-focused agreements that followed. And those agreements and that way of thinking generally arose out of a linear process in which the expert communities, both inside and outside government, in the 1960s talked a lot and generated some areas of common interest and perspective. This created a context in which policymakers could join in this discussion, identify cooperative measures, implement them, and build political trust. In the unipolar era, between the end of the Cold War and roughly 2014, the strategic stability interests of the United States shifted dramatically. Any of you who are recollect the period of the Clinton and George W. Bush administrations will remember that our deterrence strategy shifted in a fundamental way from concern about a major power peer rival, the Soviet Union, to the problem of WMD armed rogue states with long-range delivery systems. And in this context, we were not willing to accept mutual vulnerability or mutual assured destruction as the basis of a stable strategic relationship with these countries. And we put our emphasis on negating their deterrence rather than tolerating or accepting them. At the same time, in the US-Russian relationship, the common theme of the 1990s and 2000s was perhaps best summarized in the language of the George W. Bush administration. Let's take nuclear weapons out of the foreground of the US-Russian relationship and push them way into the background. And in this context, we essentially saw our approach to strategic stability in a conservative way, which is to say we were trying to conserve the stable strategic relationship that then existed between Russia and the United States, and also China and the United States. And we were able to find, through dialogue, some areas of cooperation with the Russians. We were less successful with the Chinese, and I'll come back to that. But beginning in 2014, well, I should say one other thing about that era, the Obama era, and that was that beginning in roughly 2009 with the nuclear posture review that I helped lead, we put the strategic stability language back into the dialogue with the Russians. The Clinton and George W. Bush administrations had seen the focus on strategic stability as part of an unwelcome legacy from the Cold War and a part of keeping nuclear weapons in the foreground rather than the background. But by 2009, it was very clear that cooperation with Russia was increasingly contingent on having some sort of common understanding of strategic stability and its requirements. And thus, the push began for a strategic stability dialogue of a sustained and high-level character with Russia and China. But we've moved, of course, since 2014, if not earlier, into a different era. And of course, the main contours of this era are clear to all. Putin's agenda for destruction of the European security order and pursuit of a new world order with new rules or no rules, to quote him. President Xi's agenda to be, quote, at the center of the world stage in the dominant position, a nuclear arming North Korea, the fact that these three countries all have theories of victory, thank you, Peter, for flagging that earlier work, theories of victory in conflict with the United States that involve blackmail, brinksmanship, and coercion, and that are founded on a conviction that the underlying asymmetry of stake in any conflict with us, which favors them and their judgment, would give them credibility in competing with us to out-escalate each other. Of course, they're all involved in tailoring their nuclear forces to enable these new theories of victory. Admiral Paparo, an Indo-Pacific commander, recently gave a public talk in which he argued that we're beyond the point of China exercising new capabilities. What it's engaged in today are dress rehearsals for the coming conflict over Taiwan. And of course, we have in this overall picture very worried allies and the potential for a catalytic event which would cause a tipping point and a cascade of nuclear proliferation in multiple regions. That worry from our allies is decades old. I experienced it vividly in 2009, but of course it's grown in recent years. And in this context, what does this imply for our approach to strategic stability? Well, one implication, of course, is conservation can't be our only goal. Our approach can't be simply to conserve strategic stability as it exists, because it doesn't, or it's been much reduced. We have much more instability than instability, in part because we have major power rivals who are projecting it. And thus, our objectives must become twofold: to protect strategic stability, to preserve it, but also to restore it. I'm sorry, threefold: to protect, to restore, and to manage instability. What does this require? Well, it requires reprioritizing deterrence in our overall strategy in the nuclear domain. We must get beyond replacement to sufficient, beyond a modernization program that's about replacing capabilities to a modernization program that addresses the concerns identified by the Posture Commission that the existing modernization program of record is necessary but not sufficient. Now, from an arms control, from a strategic stability perspective, that modernization program may have the beneficial consequence of giving Russia and China an incentive to come to the table to negotiate. But our diplomatic agenda, so if the needed response here to address the needs to preserve, restore stability and to manage instability, the first element is reprioritize deterrence. The second element, sorry, let me motion center my light back on. The second element is to refocus diplomacy. We should, of course, continue to seek cooperation with Russia and China on strategic stability, but we shouldn't expect it, and we shouldn't hold up everything else we need to do while waiting for them to join us for this purpose. And it may be that we can renew dialogue. There's some renewal in the U.S.-Russian dimension, but dialogue that gets us somewhere. Recall the model from the 1960s. Dialogue by the NGOs, dialogue in track 1.5 settings, dialogue at the official level, revealing areas of common interest that bring us to a point of opportunity to engage in cooperative activity to promote shared interest in strategic stability. We don't live in that world today. This is a strategy that's not working for us, hasn't worked for us for the last 20 years, isn't going to work for us so long as the current leaders of Russia and China remain in place. It may be that high-level president-to-president dialogue has some impact, but I remain skeptical given the sharp difference of interests that the leaders in Russia and China have from the interests of the United States. So I would refocus diplomacy away from just Russia and China and elevate the importance of our cooperation with our allies for strategic stability. They have a lot that they can and should contribute to deterrence and to defense and to the rebalancing of our overall approach to extended deterrence in a two-peer world. We need to work with them towards a new division of deterrence labor. And lastly, the United States needs to invest in the long-term enablers of success in protecting strategic stability and managing instability. And those are at least three enablers. First, a defense industrial base and nuclear enterprise that has the necessary capabilities and capacities and flexibility for a dynamic era. Second, long-term enabler, human capital. Can't do any of this without the right people. And thirdly, public support. Our national leadership needs to get out and make the case regularly and thoughtfully to the American public and to allied publics about why our interests in avoiding nuclear conflict and nuclear catastrophe require these adjustments to our military and diplomatic priorities. So I wanted to set our discussion of strategic stability and nuclear issues in this era in a broader conceptual framework and a broader historical perspective, because I think as we debate the current issues, the issues of the moment, so to speak, which are numerous and which we can debate energetically, I think there's benefit in taking a longer-term perspective to put our current challenges in a broader context. Peter, let me return it to you, and I look forward to the discussion.
Brad, that was extraordinary. I'm going to read the transcript with great interest in, because there's so many things that flow from this. I have one question which you've answered in part, but I'm going to repeat that is, if you're sitting in Congress and you're on the Armed Services Committee, I was going to ask you what are the 5 things that the committee ought to do with the upcoming defense budget, either in confirming what's in the budget or adding. We don't know yet what exactly, but I think we know in the nuclear business, it'll be the program of record plus the Sea Launched Cruise Missile and certainly missile defense. But what would you do if you were sitting on the committee in the armed services in terms of looking at what you would add to fulfill the various points you made, which is the industrial base, human capital, public support, but also the hardware, which we need in order to have sustained deterrence, as well as improved deterrence, as the Posture Commission recommended?
Well, I think I would, if I were the chair of that committee, I would go to the chair and ranking member of the Foreign Relations Committee and the Energy and Water Committees, and say that, look, we the Armed Services Committee can look after the hardware piece, but deterrence in this world is much more than just the hardware piece. The infrastructure needs to have the necessary agility, and the diplomacy needs to support our overall objective. Nuclear security isn't just the business of the Armed Services Committee.
Exactly.
And on the hardware side, I think the discussion I'd like to see happen is what more do we need to do for the theater nuclear posture, which the Posture Commission defined as already not fit for purpose. And whether SLCMN is sufficient, whether it can be made available to us. Well, and the answer to that question is contingent upon when it can become available.
Exactly.
If that's a solution that's 15 years away, it's not a good solution.
Yeah.
And what more we can done quickly and in a crisis to support our interests.
There's a question from I also want to just take the chance to thank all our sponsors many who were on the call today. Brian Groft from SPA writes the following, Brad. He says, Russia for some time has demonstrated a commitment to theater nuclear weapons as a counterbalance to U.S. conventional superiority. They have for a few years spoken of nuclear use over a broader European war, which could grow out of the current war in Ukraine. How has this factor limited the war itself, and is this not a vindication of theater weapons as part of nuclear deterrence?
Well, it's a reminder of the role of nuclear weapons in theater deterrence, and they have played a role in both Russian and NATO strategy. And both sides have used nuclear weapons to shape this conflict in various ways, to limit and contain it. This invites a discussion of whether, well, it invites two important discussions. One is whether the sharp asymmetry in NATO and Russian nuclear theater postures is itself a source of instability. And it invites a discussion of how and whether Russia might employ nuclear weapons in the end game in Ukraine in order to set the conditions for success in its next efforts to undo the European security order. These are two different questions, and we can go that route if you'd like, but those are the implications that leap out at me.
Another question, Brad, comes from Bill Courtney, and it's interesting. It's been raised by a couple countries in Europe, and that is, would it be helpful for Poland to join NATO's nuclear sharing program by hosting the B-61 and the F-35?
My personal view is yes. NATO's nuclear posture remains constrained by the three no's offered in conjunction with the NATO-Russia Founding Act. The statement that we have no plans, no intentions, no plans, and foresee no circumstance in which we might want to move nuclear weapons closer to the Russian border. The principles of that agreement have long been overtaken by events. Mm-hmm. And I think a remaking of NATO's nuclear posture to respect the strategic dangers presented to the alliance by Russia in the current circumstance should include not just a Polish. I'd like to see the F-35A broadly endorsed as a capability that could be utilized for the nuclear mission by any country possessing it. And to complicate for Russia, to demonstrate to Russia that there's no domain in NATO territory that would be unprotected by nuclear assets.
General retired Fred Stoss, one of our supporters and sponsors, always has to ask great questions. And let me walk you through, Brad. First, he says, great to see you and awesome words. And he says he likes your three enablers, but then he has some questions. Does the SLCM end need to move left? Number one. Number two, after February 2026, which is the end of New START, do we upload ICBMs and SLBMs? He has two more questions, but let me just go with those. Does SLCM end need to move left, and do you think we can? And then after February 2026, does it make any sense to upload our ICBMs and SLBMs, which, by the way, we can do?
Yes, 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 and yes. And if Fred would let me get away with that answer, I'd be happy to stop there. But, well, left, SLCM end, left of what? I don't think we actually know clearly what the projected timeline is.
Yeah, that's
true.
But
if it's 10 to 12 years, that's not acceptable.
I agree.
And I think the judgment of people I sometimes interact with is that if the administration really wanted to pull this to the left, it has the latitude to do so in reframing the regulatory and framework. That a lot of the 10 to 12 year timeline is involved in approvals and risk reduction measures.
Yes.
Risk aversion, and the job could still be done prudently and safely and in an environmentally correct way without losing so much time.
Agreed.
Would it be useful to do that? Definitely, because by most people's thinking, Russia's challenge to NATO, if it comes, Putin's challenge to NATO is likely in a 3 to 5 year time frame, and having a solution that's 12 years away isn't going to help with that.
Agreed.
And on upload, I mean, I'm fairly doctrinaire on this. Our deterrence strategy requires that we put at risk the things enemy leaders value. We know that the leaders of China and Russia value their ability to put us at risk by nuclear threats. We have a counterforce component, thus, to our deterrence strategy. And we shouldn't just say, well, that's hard and expensive, and we'll maintain counterforce strategy vis-a-vis Russia, but China, we won't worry. This seems to me to be a carte blanche to China to grow that force even further. So exactly. I would like to see some upload and some increased flexibility in the deterrence so that China in the enterprise, so that China looks at this landscape and says, well, 5-10 years from now, we're going to be in a worse off position rather than better off. Maybe it's time to cut a deal.
Exactly. Our president came across an article by Robert Oppenheimer's grandson, and the point made by his grandson was that nuclear deterrence, but he also used the word MAD, which mutual assured destruction, which is not our policy and hasn't been for some time, despite being described by McNamara. We would think it was our policy. But what he says is that only can work when there are two nuclear superpowers and not three, which you have to add in China. So I was wondering if you could comment on whether or not, if that's the case, then what the heck do we do in this as a substitute? Because that's not an easy deal.
Well, we can envision the possibility of escaping a relationship of mutual nuclear vulnerability with regional challengers. But a major power that's dedicated to putting the United States at risk is going to have that ability, whether or not we like it and how much money we spend to deny that. We passed through a period in the 1960s when we needed to come to terms with the fact that the Soviet Union was gaining the ability to do to us what we had the ability to do to them. And we very reluctantly came to the conclusion that there was nothing we could do about that, and stability required the avoidance of risk in war required that we accept this condition of mutual vulnerability. We have not had that discussion about China. We have not had a thoughtful, systematic review of what we can and can't accept and live with, and what our real technical options are for avoiding mutual assured destruction with China. My own view is we can't escape mutual vulnerability with China. There are things we can do to reduce our vulnerability to coercive missile strikes by both Russia and China, and I would like to do those things with missile defense. But I think moreover, I think if we dedicated ourselves to the proposition that we want to escape mutual vulnerability with China, both China and Russia would conclude that we're headed in that direction, and there would be even more unwelcome developments in their new military postures. So the net effect, I'm not sure we'd be better off.
Hey, you've answered the next question in part, but I'm going to ask it. It's from our friend Rob Sufer, who, as you know, is over at the Atlantic Council and has recently written a major piece with Mark Massa on U.S. national missile defense. And he asked the question of, we could increase the number of our forces to deal with China, or we can increase the survivability, or both. And he asked the question of what's your sense of, should we do more mobility or preferential missile defense, or both?
Well, I can, what I know on this subject, I've learned from Rob, so I'm likely to parrot back to him his answer. We definitely need to do something in a two-peer world, particularly as we're going to have, upload would only get us so far, and only on a temporary basis. And I mean temporary because as the SSBN fleet transitions to its new platform, the deliverable weapons will decline.
Yeah.
But of course, there's a practical political reality that mobile missile systems in the United States are politically challenging, and sustainment of the commitment to the VM force has been a function of politics in the Senate that would be changed if we move to a mobile force. Now, maybe you'd have a combined mobile and fixed ICBM force. In short, all of the options here are unappealing and expensive. But with Rob, I agree that we need to do something here.
Okay. Another question came in, Brad, about people in Europe and in Asia talking about building their own nuclear weapons. But what about simply transferring U.S. nuclear forces as we have in Europe? We have 100 or so gravity bombs, but we have nothing in the Pacific. What about instead of having countries develop their own nuclear forces, is they kind of borrow ours, I guess you could say, where we have, now it doesn't mean necessarily we have joint control, but you understand what we do with respect to Germany and Great Britain and Italy and Turkey. Can we expand that in Europe? I know you answered a little bit with respect to Poland, but I thought I'd be fair and ask you that general question.
Well, I'd like to see us, at the very least, make good on the policy we have had in place for 15 years, which is the policy that, so to take one step back, our current approach to extended nuclear deterrence has its roots in the presidential nuclear initiatives of the early 1990s, when essentially the United States concluded that it could meet its extended deterrence requirements in the then prevailing security environment without forward deployed nuclear weapons.
True.
And the United States brought home all of the weapons it deployed abroad in support of its allied commitment, with the footnote of retaining the minimum necessary number in Europe, which was 3% of the pre-1991 total, for the purpose of ensuring that the sharing arrangements remained viable, but in the context of a relationship with a benign Russia. And then, of course, we kept the Tomahawk nuclear cruise missile in storage, not deployed, in storage for possible redeployment, presumably for contingencies in Northeast Asia. And in 2009, 2010, we faced the bill for replacing Tomahawk with a modern cruise missile and modern warhead, and chose instead to make a commitment to make our, the decision was also made in that moment to modernize the dual capable aircraft and bomb. And so the decision was made to make the DCA capability globally available to allies in time of crisis, assuming political agreement to do so. And ever thus, this policy has been repeated in nuclear posture reviews, but we have not put ourselves in a position to implement it. We don't have a reserve force that sits in Texas that could go to Asia or Europe in time of need. And we don't have the capacity in Europe to strip something out, particularly if we expect that in a war in Asia, there'd be the risk of opportunistic aggression in Europe, and NATO would not be pleased to see American DCA departing the theater at the height of a crisis. So, at the very least, we should make good on the policy we've had. I think the Japanese and South Koreans have declared themselves to be from Kansas, the show me state. I want to see that you can do this. You Americans have said this all along. I think the South Koreans would be eager to go a step further and to participate in some form of sharing arrangement with the United States. Both Japan and South Korea already provide conventional support to nuclear operations, air coverage to bomb or task force displays. But we should remember that the last Japanese Prime Minister, Shinzo Abe, spoke about the need to begin a dialogue about nuclear sharing arrangements with the United States. And he set out a variety of options that we had never thought of, such as the deployment of U.S. nuclear-tipped cruise missiles aboard Japanese attack submarines. But there are many options short of Japan and South Korea having a nuclear bomb of their own, and we need to continue to move in that direction.
There's another question here that I have a question related to it, but the question is, I'll read it to you. It says, isn't treating tactical theater nuclear weapons like other uses, ones that would meet with overwhelming conventional response, a better approach than trying to match it? I assume what the questioner is asking is that instead of matching theater nuclear weapons with theater nuclear weapons, we should just simply say we'll use conventional response if you go to the tactical nuclear level.
Well, maybe. This is very context dependent.
Right.
If an adversary crosses the nuclear threshold solely for the purpose of gaining tactical and operational level advantages, then we should respond in the manner that's most effective for the tactical and operational level, which may be a non-nuclear response. But if the adversary has crossed the threshold in order to demonstrate its resolve, and on the conviction that we would not, that we're a paper tiger and would back down in that circumstance and would sacrifice the interest at stake, then not responding by nuclear means would have the effect of encouraging further nuclear aggression. So in that circumstance, a strong response, a nuclear response, is essential to restoring deterrence.
Agreed. Yeah. In light of that, Brad, there's another question that expands on what we've already said. Is that, let me read it to you. It says, in conjunction with nuclear defense planning, should NATO conduct nuclear exercises demonstrating the willingness and ability to proceed in the event of a failure of deterrence? And the second part of that is, could you do that politically within NATO countries? Because it would be we probably have to advertise that this is what we're doing. Now, I knew the Russians do this all the time. The question is, what's your sense as to, should we fairly publicly demonstrate what we call conventional nuclear integration, and actually demonstrate, yeah, we're willing to go to that level if necessary?
I think our failure to demonstrate that actually contributes to the problem we face. It contributes to the judgment in Moscow that we're really not willing
to go there.
That we're sort of embarrassed to be a nuclear weapon state, and we have these weapons, but we never use them. And our publics are so opposed and would be fearful of threats from Russia, and we could be counted on to back down. This is all counterproductive to our interests.
Agreed.
We should be able to demonstrate our operational concepts for conventional nuclear integration. And I think the political calculus in Europe today is very different from what it was 6 months ago. And my view is many countries would support and some would oppose very strongly. So there would be a stiff debate in NATO about a very public demonstration in this area.
True.
But it's the right thing to do.
Definitely. I'm going to go back to a question that I'm not quite sure the answer, Brad, but a lot of presidents have talked about a world of, well, at some point we'll go to zero nuclear weapons. When I talked to some of the people at Reykjavik, it was interesting is that bombers were taken off the table. France, Britain, and other nuclear powers weren't even talked about. And the major interest that President Reagan had was to ban what Ambassador Lehman called fast flyers. And particularly because those were the ones we thought would be involved in a preemptive strike, which was the worry of the time. Subsequent presidents have talked about not just reductions, but Mr. Obama in Prague talked fairly lengthily about zero nuclear weapons. And that seems to be, does that cause us a problem? One of the questioners in the chat was that, shouldn't we take this off the table? Because it leads people to say, well, why are we building nuclear weapons if our goal is to get rid of them? Albeit understand it's not, go to China and Russia and they'll say they have no interest in that. So reportedly, someone asked Kim Jong-un that question, and he said, sure, you first. So,
well, yeah, that's the nature of the anarchic system.
Yeah. So the question is, Do we continue to talk about global zero, or is it a side show that interferes with our abilities? You mentioned the third part of your three things you wanted was to sustain public support so they understand what we're doing and why we're doing it.
Yeah, I think, of course, it's the case that it's a complicating factor for deterrence and for maintaining political support for nuclear modernization. I think it's also essential to maintaining political support for nuclear modernization. I think if you every public opinion poll that I've seen finds democratic publics inherently ambivalent about nuclear weapons. They want to be rid of them. They don't want to depend on them, but they don't want to be without them.
That's true.
And the experience of NATO in the 1960s that led up to the Harmel Doctrine and the statement that the alliance had both a military and a political purpose and needed to pursue both deterrence and détente. The pursuit of détente and dialogue was essential to the preservation of deterrence because it provided some vision of a pathway out, an escape from the dilemmas and dangers of nuclear deterrence. And it was only with that foundation that the European governments would make the decision to go forward to nuclear modernization.
Understood.
And I think that is true here as well. I think if you ask the American public just to stand up and say, yay, deterrence, verily go forth, without a vision of an escape from these problems, the political support for modernization will go away.
Interesting. We got about 5-6 minutes left, but here's a very interesting question, and that is, the questioner says, building on your last answer, if you cross the threshold for solely tactical purposes, meaning we're only using tactical nuclear weapons, how do you signal that you have no strategic intentions?
Well, you do have strategic intentions, but I infer that the question is about how do you clarify that you're not seeking to transition to nuclear conflict at the strategic level of war.
Exactly. I believe that's what the questioner is trying to do.
Well, the short answer is by not attacking homelands, but by attacking externally deployed forces. And the other part of the answer is by not utilizing strategic systems, but theater systems instead. This is the primary weakness in an extended deterrence posture that depends primarily on the triad. Okay. Is that if we employ a weapon from it, our adversary is going to find it quite reasonable to say, okay, well, then we'll retaliate with our strategic systems. And instead of leaving them with a very big step from a theater system to a strategic system. This is the reason I'd like to have a better toolkit for theater deterrence.
Well said. Yeah. I'm going to turn this back over to our president, Jim Piotrowski. And Jim, wanted to know if you have any further questions. And I also wanted to make a point is General Guevara, who's head of U.S. Air Force A-10, is going to be speaking at the Capitol Hill Club on May 16th in person over breakfast. So we will have both the Navy and Admiral Wolf and General Guevara from the Air Force, and Uzi Rubin, who's going to be talking about missile defense as well as missile threat. So we're trying to go back more and more to the Capitol Hill Club for breakfast, as we started doing this way back in 1983. So Jim is our president of NIDS, and he's on here, and I'd like you to turn it back over to you, sir, with a few minutes left, and see if you have any comments you'd like to make or further questions for Dr. Roberts.
Thank you, Peter.
Well, thank you, Peter. And yeah, excellent talk here, Brad. We're in interesting times, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. But so many things are happening, and I'm glad we're able to have these kind of discussions. I applaud you for not only for being a part of this, but for taking so many questions. And we had some of the best interactions that we've had on these seminars for quite some time. And I'm asking, the people that are here, you find this valuable, get the word out, because many people don't understand some of these things. And my question about MAD was deliberately there because they knew you would talk about it, not even being, it gets thrown around so much in the news that seems to be our strategy and our policy. It is not even our policy for nuclear weapons engagement. So there's so much more to be done here, and I hope that we can bring you in a future talk. As I'm looking through, there's just so many questions here. We're going to get them out to you. Kimberly will do a good job of that, and she'll talk here in a minute. But with I don't know if you have any final comments as you look sort of at the questions. Any final comments you want to make regarding our future and what you see as the future of our nuclear weapons policies as we roll into what is now a new administration, but also an entirely new future with so many different countries sort of seeking to find the value of this weapon and the way it may be used, good or bad for us. So I'd be interested in what your comments are, and then we'll turn it over to Kimberly.
Well, thank you, Jim. That's an opportunity for an invitation to trouble for commenting on the current policy environment, because it's so unpredictable at this moment, and so many things are unclear and so many mixed messages. I would say just that, yes, many more countries than before are thinking again or more deeply about the deterrence challenges they face in their security environment and the possible tools they can apply to reduce their risks. And yes, they're thinking about the role of nuclear weapons and the credibility of possible nuclear threats. This is a debate that is intimately involved with their thinking and questions about us. What role we, the United States, want to play in the world today, whether we in fact still have common interests and common values, or perceive that we do, which have been the foundation of our alliances, and whether we have the economic wherewithal to adapt to a two-peer world. And I see the nuclear questions more inextricably linked than in decades to fundamental questions about America itself, and American thinking about its place in the world and roles and responsibilities and values and interests. So hold on to your hat. It's going to be an interesting time.
Well, thank you, Brad. That was sage advice coming from you, and thank you so much. So I'm going to turn it over to Kimberly to close us out. My last comment, I'm going to echo Peter as well. Thank you so much to our sponsors who make this happen. Without you, none of this happens, and I think the world becomes even a more dangerous place when we don't have these discussions. So there we go. Kimberly, up to you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Roberts, today for sharing your time and expertise with our audience and with us, of course. And thank you to Peter Huessy for bringing this important content to our attention and helping NIDS fulfill their mission to advance peace, promote stability, and shape policy through applied research, education, and consulting. Who do you know that may find value in our programming? Please share our offerings with your friends and colleagues. Nominate someone for a seat on one of our podcasts. Subscribe to Global Security Review, or engage with us on social media. We would love to hear from you. Together we can advance peace, stability, by evaluating deterrence practices like we did here today and policies, and affirm that a credible nuclear deterrent is the bedrock for American national security. Thank you for attending today and have a peaceful day. You can look for this recording, which you can share with others in the next week. And we're happy that you came. Thank you.
So Dr. Roberts, on my behalf, thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Kimberly. Thank you, Jim. Take care, everybody.
Take care.